They said a girl from the market could never stand beside the heir of the Tran family. But James and Diep just proved them wrong. Hello everyone, and welcome back to today's story. In this episode, love pushes back harder than ever. Because despite Mr. Tran Sön's rejection, despite class, pride, and pressure, James and Diep finally make their choice. A simple hilltop proposal, a handmade dress, and a quiet plan for a wedding that could heal a family or break it forever. Stay until the end to feel the moment everything changes. And if you enjoy stories like this, please consider subscribing to help our small channel reach 1,000 subscribers. It truly means the world to us. When love stands against the family, James chooses Diep, not the Tran legacy. Morning mist still clung to the tin rooftops of the quiet countryside when James sat alone in his truck, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. His phone buzzed. Across the screen flashed the name he dreaded. Dad, Tran Sơn. James closed his eyes for a second before answering. Have you submitted the quarterly report yet? Mr. Tran Sön's voice came through cold and sharp. Yes, Dad. But James knew, like every time, the business question was only the warm-up, and right on cue. And what's this I'm hearing? That you still plan to marry that girl? James inhaled slowly. Yes, Dad. Diep and I have made our decision. A long, icy silence. Then his father exploded. James! Do you think the Tran family is a joke? I've met that girl several times. Every time I look at her, all I see is a poor, uneducated street vendor who thinks only about vegetables and market stalls. And you want to marry someone like that? James clenched his jaw. Dad, you don't understand Diep. I've seen enough. Mr. Tran cut him off. She was abandoned by her ex-husband, then picked up some child to raise. You think someone like that brings honor to the Tran name? James looked out the window. Outside, Diep was rinsing fresh greens in a white plastic basin, sunlight catching her smile. That wasn't picking up, Dad, he said quietly. She adopted me. You know that. A sharp, mocking laugh crackled through the phone. Adopted? Or dragged home another burden? You think I believe those stories? Every word stabbed deeper. Dad, why won't you try looking at her differently? James's voice trembled between hurt and plea. Because I've already looked. Mr. Tran's voice was like metal striking metal. The Tran family has been built for generations. You're throwing it away for a girl who sells vegetables? James said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. Dad, this time I'm not changing my mind. Good. Mr. Tran's tone froze. Then go ahead and marry her. But don't expect the Tran family to approve. The call ended with a cold, abrupt beep. James sat motionless, breath heavy, the warm morning light failing to lift the weight in his chest. That evening, in the Tran family mansion in the city, Mr. Tran paced the marble floor, his leather shoes echoing sharply. He's lost his mind, he muttered. He actually wants to marry that girl. Marry her no matter what. Mrs. Huyen placed her teacup down, watching her husband quietly. You've met Diep several times, but each time you only saw her poverty, she said softly. Did you ever look at how she treats Nee, or James, or even us? Mr. Tran slammed his palm onto the table. You think I haven't looked? I've looked thoroughly. And that's exactly why I know she's not suitable. Not suitable. Or are you just afraid of what people will say about our family? Her voice was calm, but precise. He froze for a moment. His pride flashed hot in his eyes. He's the only son of the Tran family. I won't allow him to marry someone like her. Mrs. Huyen sighed. You sound exactly like your father years ago, forbidding you to marry me because I was poor and from the countryside. And look at us now. We still chose each other. For the first time, his face wavered. Old pain flickered behind his eyes. But he turned away, voice low and hoarse. That was different. What's different? She pressed gently. That now we're wealthy? So you've forgotten what it feels like to love without conditions? Mr. Tran didn't answer. He grabbed his coat and stormed out, the door slamming like thunder. Mrs. Huyen watched him leave, tears gathering. James, don't be afraid. Mom will stand with you. 2 days later, James drove Diep up the hill, the place he always escaped to when life suffocated him. Diep lifted her face to the wind, her hair fluttering like silk. It's beautiful, she whispered. I've never been anywhere like this. James looked at her. The simple clothes, the faint trace of soil on her fingers from the morning market, her gentle smile. To him, she was more beautiful than any polished city girl his father had introduced before. Diep? His voice cracked slightly. She looked at him, reading worry instantly. Your father called again, didn't he? He said, you're not fit for the Tran family. She lowered her eyes. I know. Every time he saw me, his eyes said everything. I don't care about those eyes. James stepped closer and held her hand. I only care about yours. She let out a soft laugh, tears spilling at the same time. Don't fight your family because of me. I'm not fighting because of you, he said quietly. I'm standing up because of us. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Diep gasped. James, no, don't tell me. He knelt. No stage, no flowers. Just wind, sky, and his trembling heartbeat. Diep, I've proposed twice, and you turned me down because you were scared. This time, I'm not asking. I'm asking you to believe me. I choose you, even if the Tran family never does. Diep burst into tears. After everything, you still choose me? I chose you the day I saw you shielding me from the rain with an old tarp. He slipped the ring onto her finger. And I'll choose you for the rest of my life. She nodded repeatedly, speechless. The hilltop wind swept around them, carrying their laughter far beyond the valley. And James knew no storm ahead would ever be worse than losing her. Dawn filtered through the curtains the next morning, painting warm streaks across the wooden floor. Diep was still asleep beside him, her hand resting on his chest, fingers curled around the ring she refused to take off. James watched her quietly, a soft peace blooming in his chest. But peace wasn't enough. It was time to act. He stepped onto the balcony, inhaled the crisp morning air, and called his assistant. Find me wedding locations, he said calmly. Simple ones. Soon, within the next few weeks. His assistant froze. You mean, it's official, sir? Yes, James said, eyes on the rising sun. It's time. By the time Diep woke up, breakfast was already set. Warm bread, soft-boiled eggs, honey pomelo jam. James sat across from her, laptop open, his calendar glowing. Diep, he began, voice soft but serious. I want to get married soon. She stiffened. James, your father. I'm not waiting for him anymore. But if he cuts ties with you, James gave a small, sad smile, the kind that held both pain and freedom. then he'll miss the most important day of his son's life. Tears filled her eyes. Have you really thought this through? Are you sure this is what you want? I've been sure since the day I watched you teach Nee to color on the porch. She laughed through her tears. Every word you say hurts my heart in the best way. Because it's true. That afternoon, they returned to the hill, the place that had witnessed their promise. Diep carried a small notebook filled with pencil sketches. What do you think? She asked, pointing to the massive banyan tree. Could we hold the ceremony right here? James looked up at the ancient roots wrapped around the stones. It's perfect, like something that's meant to be. She smiled, then hesitated. James, tell me honestly, are we doing this for love or to rebel against your father? The breeze rustled the leaves as he paused. Diep, maybe a little of both, but mostly because I want our life to begin not from someone else's approval, but from our choice. Her eyes softened, a mixture of sadness, strength, and devotion. Then no more waiting, she whispered. As soon as possible. Agreed. Meanwhile, in the Tran mansion, Mr. Tran sat in his study, tea long gone cold. He had called James several times. No answer. Mrs. Huyen stepped in quietly. He's avoiding you, she said gently. I don't care, he snapped. He's destroying his future. Or maybe he's finally choosing his happiness. Mr. Tran turned, eyes sharp. Happiness doesn't feed anyone. She walked closer, placing a hand on the desk. Years ago, you told me you would do anything just to see your son smile. Now he's smiling. And you can't stand it because you're not the reason. His hand trembled slightly. Her words cut deeper than she knew. He's planning a wedding, isn't he? He muttered. She nodded. Very soon. Mr. Tran looked away, eyes dark. If he walks that path, he walks it without my blessing. Mrs. Huyen didn't argue. She only said softly, then don't expect him to ask for it. Back in the countryside, Diep sat at the edge of the small house, stitching the hem of a white linen dress. Simple, soft, quietly beautiful. Nee sat nearby, weaving tiny daisy flowers. Mommy Diep, is this the dress you'll wear at your wedding? Yes, sweetheart. Will Grandpa come? Diep paused, then smiled gently. Maybe not, but the people who truly love us will. Nee placed the daisy crown on her head. You look like a princess. James appeared at the doorway, sleeves rolled up, sawdust still on his arms. She's more than a princess, he said with a quiet laugh. She's my future. Diep blushed. Don't say that in front of Nee. Say it again, Daddy. Nee giggled. James pulled both of them into his arms. You two are my whole world. That night, they sat on the porch under a sky scattered with stars. The air smelled faintly of pomelo blossoms, crickets singing their quiet songs. James held Diep's hand gently. Tomorrow, he whispered, let's tell everyone. Our friends, the neighbors, the workers at the farm. I want them all to know this is real. They'll talk, you know, Diep murmured. Your father's friends, the board, the whole company. Let them talk. James brushed her cheek. Eventually, they'll see what I see. Real love doesn't ask for permission. She rested her head on his shoulder. Then, let's start. James intertwined his fingers with hers, looking out into the dark trees. In 2 weeks, he whispered, we'll hold the wedding, whether anyone comes or not. And beneath the quiet night, they made a vow. not just to marry, but to choose each other against the world if they had to. In this chapter, James and Diep face the biggest turning point of their lives. Despite meeting Diep several times, Mr. Tran Sơn refuses to accept her, judging her background, her past, and even her adopted daughter, Nee. His disapproval grows stronger, but James's resolve becomes unshakable. On a quiet hilltop, he proposes for the third and final time, choosing love over the expectations of the Tran family. While Mr. Tran battles his pride and fears of losing his son, James and Diep begin preparing a simple wedding under the banyan-tree, a ceremony built not on wealth or approval, but on sincerity and courage. From hand-sewn dresses to daisy crowns and late-night promises on the porch, their small home becomes a symbol of the life they choose together. But with the wedding approaching, one question remains: will love heal this family or break it for good?